Today I'm going to show you my method for making water kefir. This is water kefir that's been fermenting for about a day and a half. People normally say 2 days, but I find that mine has been fermenting pretty fast and it's getting carbonated and then fermenting long enough that the carbonation goes away. And I want to see if I can get it more carbonated if I cut down on the fermentation time a little bit. So you experiment a little bit, but the guideline is about 2 days. I have a plastic or nylon mesh strainer, and you can use metal with water kefir grains, but because I had this anyway, I figured it was safer to just go ahead and go with the plastic one. So I'm going to pour my fermented water kefir through the strainer. Now my water kefir grains are in the strainer here, and then the done water kefir is here, and I'll show you how I start a new batch. This is where you would start if you have brand new water kefir grains, if they were given to you by a friend. If you bought them, you might need to do a rehydrating step first, and I've never done that part because I've only had the grains that have been given to me by a friend. So I have here about a 2-quart pitcher. Turbinado sugar is ideal, but if you're using other sugar like this evaporated cane juice that I'm using, you can just add a splop of molasses and that'll work fine. The water kefir grains really like the molasses part of the sugar and all of the nutrients in it. If splop of molasses is not specific enough for you, go for about a tablespoon. And then I use hot water, just about maybe a cup of hot water or even a little less in order to dissolve the sugar. That's especially important if you're using turbinado sugar because that's really not going to dissolve in cold water. If you really want to, you can use the regular sugar and molasses in cold water and just stir it a lot till it dissolves, but I find this to be easier. Now that the half cup of sugar and splop of molasses are dissolved in the hot water, I'm just going to fill this up almost to the top with cold water. Of course, I'm using filtered water from the Berkey. It's really not recommended that you use regular tap water with the water kefir grains. They really don't like chlorine. And then if this is not yet room temperature, you can let it cool down for a minute before you put the water kefir grains back in there. But I find that once I've added the rest of the cold water, it's generally a fine temperature for adding the water kefir grains back in. And then I'm putting the water kefir grains back in. This is about half a cup for 2 quarts of water, or for half a gallon, depending on how you prefer to think of that. So for a quart, you would use a 1/4 cup of water kefir grains, a 1/4 cup of sugar, a little bit of molasses if needed, and then just fill it up with water. Now this I will set over on my counter to ferment, and this is supposed to be loosely capped. I usually don't worry about making it terribly loose. I haven't had any trouble with explosions, but I definitely do want it to be loose enough that if the fermentation gases build up, it doesn't explode the pitcher. So I'm going to plan to ferment this probably for another day and a half or 2 days again, whichever works into my schedule better. And then this is the finished water kefir, which most people at this point will add flavorings, and I'll do some separate videos at some point showing you some different flavoring ideas that I've used. You can also drink it plain. It has a fairly mild flavor, just a little bit sweet, a little bit tart, but it's definitely fun to add some flavorings and make homemade soda. You can do fresh ginger for homemade ginger ale. I've mixed it with a sweetened herbal iced tea, half and half. You can also mix it half and half with juice and do a second fermentation. And it usually carbonates. Like I said, I've had some trouble with that, but it's always been at least lightly carbonated. And so I've had a lot of fun with the water kefir and experimenting with different homemade soda flavors. And I have to say I like the flavor better than kombucha. So there's water kefir. I forgot to mention that when you're doing the second ferment on the water kefir, you do want to cap this one tightly if you're trying to carbonate it, because that's what keeps the carbonation gases in and produces the bubbles as it ferments.